We see you over
I
there,
was
Kelsey.
I was on my
Just
morning
rub
walk,
it in, baby. Just rub it in.
a morning walk this morning and thinking, well, it's just under 3 weeks and we'll be into March. February will be gone. I always like to see February get on by weather-wise, and felt like spring today already. It's nice. So I'd like to call our meeting to order. Ask you to join me in a moment of silence. It seems like there's always something in the world going on, some tragedy, and we've seen the images from Turkey and Syria of the devastation from that terrible earthquake over there. And just ask as you take a moment of silence to pray for and reflect on those who are under duress and suffering as a result of that earthquake. Thank you. Amen. Thank you very much. So we've got a few items here to discuss today. One that's come up before is a discussion about our procurement limits and try to improve the efficiency of our procurement process. And I'm not sure if Amy, you were going to handle this one, or Matt Froelich or Gary Cooper, but Amy, you want to lead off?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone.
Yep.
This will probably be a group effort. So we talked about this a bit in November, in one of our November meetings of procurement limits. The city team has been participating in procurement excellence, and those are the team members included on that team. Gary, Susan T, and Matt Froelich are all on the call. I'm not sure if Mallory is as well. So they worked out, they mapped out our procurement process and identified pain points, etc. Did a lot of interviews and have figured out that one of our biggest challenges relating to timing and delays in the procurement process. One of those is our thresholds. Right now, we currently have a $30,000 threshold for formal competitive procurements. They did a lot of research, like I said, other cities and around the country and also within our region. And our thresholds are pretty much lower than everybody else's. So what we had discussed in November is us possibly increasing our formal competitive procurement threshold to $100,000 and making other adjustments to the policy to account for that change, because when you move that up, you kind of have to move other things up as well. At that time, you had all asked for a little bit more information on how this would affect what city council approves. So we have some of that information for you as well. So right now, these are our current limits. You can see here, council approval is 40,000. The formal solicitation, that's the 30,000 we were talking about. And the requested limits are right next to that. You want to look at those for a second. We had talked about them, but it was a long time ago.
So Amy, just
Yes.
explain again and the difference between the second and the third entry on there, the small professional service and the small professional service 24-month limit. What is the qualifier with that?
Gary, you want to take that one?
Yes, ma'am. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Under the small professional services, Councilmember Shade, the city folks are free to just select off a vendor list up to $50,000. However, that vendor can only earn up to $100,000 per every 24 months by using that method. We're asking to raise that total. Does that make sense?
No.
Explain that again, Gary.
So let's say Capital Projects picked Lilio to do a $25,000 project off the small professional services list. He can only be picked 8 times. No, I'm sorry. It's 100, isn't it?
Right, 2
He
times.
can only be picked 4 times in 2 years off of that list using the small professional service method. because the total of those 4 purchases would be more than $100,000. There's a limit. In other words, they just don't want you using the same person over and over and over and over. The policy was written to try and encourage folks to spread the wealth, if you will.
To bid it out. So it's $50,000 individually, but they could use that vendor twice, basically in a 24-month period, Councilmember Shade. Does that make sense?
So in other words, they can, are you talking about like splitting the contract? Is that what we're talking about? That's what they do?
No, it would be 2 separate contracts.
Okay,
Like, say TNT wanted to use them one time for 50, and then Capital Projects used them one time for 50. Theoretically, they have used their self up for a 24-month period because they've reached that $100,000 limit.
It's
I'm just
citywide.
looking at this chart. It looks like extending this without council approval to $300,000. And then the large IDC contract to $750,000. Just seems kind of high numbers. I may be the only one feeling that way, but that's a lot of dough without any oversight.
Yeah, the policies, they would still have to come to procurement or to the council if it was over the council limit. It's just,
So even though it was $50,000, Councilmember Shade, that would still come to council.
Right,
It's over 40. And so now they're just asking for 100. And it would still have to come to council because that would be the new limit.
right. But you talk about anything under $100,000 does not come
Right.
before council. Anything
Right.
under $300,000 doesn't come before council. Anything under $750 doesn't come before council.
no, 750 is a running total over a certain period of that LDC contract.
Well, explain that to me a little bit more then.
Matt Fountain, can you help me with that one? Are you here? It's the same theory when we have these large IDC contracts that stormwater uses. It's the same theory as the professional services.
Yeah, I can weigh in on that, Mr. Cooper. That's no problem. So, Councilman Shade, this one, the IDC contracts are the indefinite delivery contracts. So you basically are. There's a couple of different ways to do it. Typically, you're qualifying construction contractors for a list of potential services. You will frequently contract with 2 or 3 vendors who will include prices for those services within that solicitation. So you still have a competitive price solicitation for types of services. So for us, it might be, here's how much we charge per foot to clean a 24-inch pipe that is less than 50% full of sediment. Here is how much we charge to clean a 36-inch pipe that is less than 50% full. Here is how much we charge for a foot of videoing and inspecting stormwater lines. So what we do is we basically contract with someone for fixed prices on that work. And that goes through council. The IDC comes to council and is approved at council, the IDC contract. And then what the department can do is issue what are called task orders off of that contract. So we might say, hey, we've had this run of clogged pipe on Orange Grove. Can, contractor at these prices that have been approved by council that you basically submitted as part of your competitive bid, we want you to go clean 300 feet of 24-inch pipe on Orange Grove Road under this existing contract. And they will say, okay, and they will do that work and then invoice you for that. And what it is now is we're currently capped where you can't spend more than $500,000 per year doing that. As a department, for instance, we have, I don't know what the exact numbers are. I think it's roughly $800,000 set aside for pipe cleaning in those IDCs. So right now we can't use the cheapest contractor for all of the work. We actually have to shift at some point and start using the more expensive contractor because we can't spend more than $500,000 in a year on that one contractor. So even though we know that it would be cheaper to use the cheapest contractor, we actually are required to go use the more expensive contractor, in this case for $300,000 of that, because we're capped at $500,000 per year in the limit.
So
That
this
would
is,
be there are upsides and downsides. I mean, it's never fair to say, there are no downsides. You might get more interest from more contractors if they know they will have a shot at winning work, even if they're not the lowest bidder contractor. So there is a risk that you'll get fewer bidders, especially the ones who tend to be higher on the contracts. That's not always a downside, but it could lead to a potential bidder being less price competitive if they think they're not going to have other people bidding. So it's, just like any open bid, there's upsides and downsides to all kinds of approaches. That's the IDC only, just for the IDC.
So the restriction is not per contract, it's on an annual basis.
So the contracts are set up as annual contracts. That's why it's built that way. It's a for an indefinite delivery contract, it's the indefinite delivery over a length of time that is typically set up as a year. So it's not a predefined scope of work. Like, you can't bid out $800,000 worth of cleaning competitively, or $700,000 of cleaning, and not come to council with it. Instead, you bid line items of typical work you would do, but you don't know exactly where or how or when you will do that work. So that's why the IDC number is so much higher than the other procurement thresholds, because it does still come through council. It just doesn't, each of those individual task orders don't come through council once you've approved the overall contract and the prices within that contract.
Amy, if we raise these limits, what other restrictions are there on going forward with these contracts?
Sorry, I muted myself.
Yeah.
What do you mean, Councilmember Shade? I'm not sure I understand.
Well, so run through a scenario, and I think Matt gave us a really good example of what we're talking about with these general contractors and subcontractors and this annual basis. And, we're box ourselves in on a taking the higher bid as opposed to the lower bid or the higher contract a little bit. Are there any other restrictions? If we raise these limits, what other restrictions are there that are cumbersome or that we have to be aware of in order to award this? Are there any other restrictions? Are there any other roadblocks?
Well, I think that probably our capital projects people would probably speak to that a little bit better. I think this is the biggest roadblock, Councilmember Shea, because of the way, the time it takes to take it through council and everything else that we have to do. And because all the costs have increased so much, I think probably there's more items that are having to come to council than used to before, just because of price escalation. So it's just taking a bit more time to get some of our projects done. Even smaller projects, like some of the renovations to fire stations and things like that, we're seeing that. If I could flip to the next slide real quick, just because you had asked the question, this might help a little bit too, Councilmember Shade. Just looking at all of the things that came through Ways and Means in 2022, you're looking at this, if we did this, it would save about 33% of items coming to you. So the city council would still see 67% of the items. So it isn't a huge reduction. You would still be seeing a majority of the items. Does that help at all?
Yeah, but does that help? Does that also address what Matt was talking about as far as the cost of these projects? Is there a dollar value to that as well?
And Ms. Wharton, I can chime in if you'd like on.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I think there's a couple items. We talked about the IDCs, right? The IDCs are a little bit of an unusual animal in that stormwater uses them. I don't know how commonly they're used in the rest of the city, but because they still come through council for approval, they're a little bit different than some of the other discussion points. I think a lot of the other discussion items, especially the formal solicitation process item, is a significant cost for us, in that when we are preparing like a contract document set, plan specifications for public bid, the process is much more formal and the effort that goes into preparing those document sets is much higher, because you have to create something that is that can be advertised with minimal contact with the vendors for basically a blind bid to be submitted. And then you have to be able to support those costs without change orders with those contractors. So that the cost of preparing that document set versus asking for 3 bids, generally written bids with some discussion with the contractors of what it is, our effort and our cost is much higher to do those formal solicitations and go through that process than it is when we're basically asking 3 qualified vendors for prices. So that's one aspect. I just wanted to touch on, I think, Ms. Wharton, you showed on the previous slide, or the slides after this one you just showed a minute ago. Part of what's happened, Councilman Shade, is if you go back when we last changed these, which I don't actually know how long ago it was, but I am presuming certainly more than 5 years ago, likely more than 10 years ago, a lot of items that didn't used to get caught in this process are now being caught because of inflation. So many of the small things that never would have come to council are now starting to come through council. So it's just putting a lot of additional burden on staff to be able to, again, prepare these document sets and prepare these plan sets on items that normally would never have had that happen. As Ms. Wharton mentioned, the larger items that do come through Ways and Means, even with these changes, which is still 67% of the items, those are at a level where we're doing all of that work because they're larger projects, they're larger procurements. There are things that we do need those open bids. We do, price competitiveness starts to matter. What's happening on some of these is the attempt to save money by doing all that additional work in an open bid is costing us more money than the savings is bringing in because of how many people and how much effort they have to do to go through to try to save $500 or something on an open bid potentially. That's my quick addition to the other hurdles that are somewhat harder to see in this process.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did not mean to hog the conversation. I apologize.
No. It's all good questions. And just to be clear, on where you see the bigger numbers here, 300,750, the large IDC and the small professional service 24-month limit. Those are both cases where council would approve the overall contract, so to speak, with the vendor, but it just enables us to go back to him whenever there's a true need, less than the $100,000 limit, and be able to move forward with a contract without having to come back to council again. Maybe I'm complicating it, but isn't that right? You still got to approve that large IDC contract that goes up to 750 by council, correct?
That's correct for the IDC contract. Yes, those still have, the actual contract itself would still come through council as a Ways and Means item. It's just how much money can be spent on the contract before the IDC methodology is not usable anymore.
Gotcha.
The small professional service limit, the 300,000, is a little bit different, that each of those contracts can only be 100,000 in this current scenario. If you were to amend a contract to be more than 100, that amendment would have to come back through council because you now would have triggered your threshold limit. The 300 is basically saying what we did right now is you limited how much you could use the same vendor under this faster procurement methodology, to say that no vendor can do more than $300,000 of that type of work per year on 3 completely unrelated separate $100,000 contracts. You can't split it into 2 separate contracts and pretend that it's 2 small contracts to avoid Ways and Means. Like, that's not legal. It's still got to come to council in that scenario. But that's what that 300 limit is. There'd be no individual contract approved for 300. It just lets the same vendor do up to $300,000 of unrelated work that way.
Right. And Amy, and anyone, did we resolve the question that we raise the limits, that we would make sure or require that we solicit from any minority vendor who does that kind of work that's on our approved minority vendor list? Did we talk further about that?
We haven't. That's a little bit later in the slides, Mayor, that we had talked about that would be something that we would need to include in all of this as well.
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned that the county did something like that.
I have a slide on that later about that.
Yeah.
If you want to I can
Okay.
speak to it if you'd like me to.
All right.
So that was one of the questions, and what the county does, and that we could incorporate something like that into our policy as well. I would let one of the team members talk about that a little bit more, if you want any more information on that.
Well, I don't know about y'all, but I feel like if we're gonna raise the limits, we ought to have this requirement added as well, that kind of follow the suit of the county. I think that's a, you know, a good step.
The only other thing I really had was just some, I had that just to show that you'd still be seeing, council would still be seeing a majority of the transactions, to give you a little bit more comfort level there. And then just some comparisons to other jurisdictions that we talked about before, if you wanted that information. Councilmember Waring has his hand up, Mayor.
Councilmember Waring?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think this is a wonderful idea. I think your point about adding MWBE in there, as the county does, is great. I want to thank Matt and Amy and all the team for bringing this forward, because I actually think if you were to go back to when that 40,000 limit was put in place, I think it's a lot more than 5 or 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You just factored in inflation, it would be at this level, in my opinion. So I think it's a great idea. Bringing it forward. As a matter of fact, we had a meeting that Ms. Parker, Council Lady Parker, had called along with Matt and some other people, Stormwater, Dale, a number of people a week and a half or so ago. This came up, so I really appreciate this being added, Amy and team, to this ad hoc committee. And when you think about it, if we are successful in putting in a system that collects more stormwater fees, as opposed to on the property tax bill versus people just not paying it, we're going to have more money for these smaller projects, which, if the old system stays in place, it just bogs staff down with being able to come forward with contracts and take action steps. And we all want action steps. So I just want to thank everybody involved, you, the mayor, as well, in getting this in front of all of us.
All right.
So we talked about that. So really, Councilmember Waring, you had asked that we talk about this at Public Works as well. So I guess we could just talk about the same slides at Public Works Committee.
I think that'd be good. For some reason, the calendar fell a little bit differently. I thought it would actually come to Public Works before we'd have this this workshop right here. But it should be a short conversation at Public Works. Let's put it like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Then it could come forward to council, and
So that's what my next bullet was, if everybody is on board, this committee and then Public Works Committee, we would like to take it to council for approval, either the last meeting of February or the first meeting in March.
Well, I sure like to root for the last meeting in February if we could.
Okay.
Let's get it done.
Councilmember Appel, you got something?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just real briefly, I want to make sure I understand. If we had something like this in place, that would have avoided some of the delay we had after Hurricane Ian with getting the contractors on board to help supplement some of the trash pickup. I just wanted to kind of see if that concrete example, I think that might still be fresh in our mind, would have been handled differently had we had some of these higher thresholds in place.
I think they fell in the same price range as well.
They were below 100,000, Councilmember Rappel. So that's a good example, because we ended up having to put it on your desk the day of council. If you remember, it wasn't included in the agenda. So we could get it done fast. So that is a good example, because both of us were under 100,000, but over 40. So.
Got it. I appreciate that. I just think that that's really something we ought to be keeping in mind, that, when we're in a pinch and we need to get some additional resources. And there's plenty of checks and balances internally. This would be a great way to, get our citizens the services they need in a timely manner. So appreciate everybody bringing this forward. I think this is really good and common sense here.
I think Councilmember Waring's right. Probably that $40,000 limit was set about 20 plus years ago. Prices have changed a little bit since then. And everything would go through the procedure, right, Gary? And you'd verify 3 bids were obtained and 1 minority if applicable.
Yes, sir. And to speak to Councilmember Appel's comments, where this gives us a lot more room, an example would be the Hazel Parker roof. We had to do a formal solicitation, roof replacement. We did a formal solicitation for that. We had to prepare the document, put it out for 3 weeks, get it back. Bids came in at like $65,000. We ended up having to wait another week or 2 to get it to council. All those weeks could have been saved if we could have just gone and got 3 quotes and let them start working on the roof. So that's where it's really going to help us if we take that 30 to 100. But yes, sir, there's still competition. They still have to go get quotes, and we will work on the language to make sure that they go to Ruth's list. And where it's applicable, we will solicit at least 1 off of that list.
Great. Jason, you want to add anything from your perspective? I know you have a lot of procurement in this room.
And I'm sorry, I thought this was a 4 o'clock meeting, so I was diligently doing something else and realized because Edmund sent me a text. So I don't know what all you've all covered so far, but Gary's example is a perfect example, and it crosses, it permeates the park system. Let's say you had a small trail refurbishment project or a small landscape project or a small kitchen project that we determine as small, but due to the cost of doing business, it now a $60,000 or an $80,000 or a $50,000 project. Sometimes you have to go through this entire process, and it's just time consuming, and it would make us more efficient if those limits were lifted to the numbers. I'm assuming up to 100 is maybe what y'all were talking about. And then also professional services is the same thing. If, for instance, we were trying to do a physical survey of the low line, but based on the value of that work, it would have required us to do a selection committee with staff and city council members so that we could prepare an advertisement for professional services to just do a physical survey of the low line, having a surveyor going out there, measuring, doing utility surveys, topography, and all of those sorts of things. So, and I think this was mentioned, the cost of doing business is more now, and we would greatly appreciate the consideration to raise these limits in order to get the work done efficiently within the bounds of the rules, of course.
Gotcha. Councilmember Gregory?
Yeah. What I know we talked a little bit about earlier about savings in terms of staff times and prepping documents, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have sort of a figure of what those savings might be?
I don't have those calculated, but in general, we can let you know that it takes a considerable amount of time to put together an advertisement, coordinate meetings with everybody that needs to be involved, and then go through all of the steps that is required based on the existing procurement limits. So it would certainly help free up staff time considerably to pay attention to the work they're already doing and or to get other projects done. We could certainly figure that out. It might take a while to get an exact dollar figure for you, though.
No, Nate, I have a sense, but just wanted to see if you had some hard numbers.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Amy, anything else on this?
No, we'll just bring this to Public Works next week, and then hopefully we can bring it to council at the end of February for
Great.
approval.
Okay, terrific. So
So-
next up is a discussion about purchase challenges. I think everybody has seen, if you've been out to buy a vehicle lately, but it's compounded by the number of vehicles we buy in a year's time. Who's going to update us on this one?
So I'm going to talk to it, but I have Matt Althoff is on here, Scott Newsom with the police department on here as well, just if you have any specific questions about what they're doing and the woes they're experiencing and trying to do, just purchase vehicles. First problem we have is the state contract that has changed drastically for 2023. It used to include makes and models and a cost included with it. It no longer does that. It's a list of dealerships, both in-state and out-of-state, that sell a particular make of a vehicle. So it's just causing extra work for our staff, having to call dealerships that are on the state contract to see if they have a specific vehicle we need, if it's available, to get quotes and everything else. So the state contract has made this even more difficult for us. Like I said, there's no cost either, but it does state that the vendor can charge up to 6% over dealer invoice. So that's also requiring our staff to negotiate prices. Scott Newsom has been successful in negotiating down to about 3% for one of our state contract vendors. But just so you know, this is adding cost to vehicles as well, in addition to just the increased cost in vehicles because of how everything is right now. The ones that are listed on state contract are limited in the product they can provide. For example, we need Malibus for the police department. There's only one vendor in Florida that's selling them, and they don't have the inventory. So we wouldn't even be able to purchase them anyway, because they don't have them. And we need 5 to 10 of them. There is a vendor in South Carolina we can get them from, but they are not on state contract. So that's just another challenge to us purchasing vehicles. Scott, jump in if I'm saying anything wrong, please. Another problem is availability. So there's order banks that the manufacturers have, and they decide when the open and closing dates are for the manufacturer. Scott, go ahead. He's got his hand up. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the example on the Malibus, we haven't bought any or purchased any unmarked cars for Central Detectives in the last 2 years. Last time we purchased them was in 2020, so we're overdue to replace their vehicles. As Amy said, the only GM contractor on the state contract doesn't have any and won't have any in 2023 model year. A Columbia Chevrolet dealership will have them and has offered them at an extremely attractive price, a price that's equal to or better than the fleet pricing I would expect on a state contract. So in this case, through a lot of digging, the cars are available. What's not available is the ease of me just putting a state contract number on a purchase request and we're good to go. And that's another case to where, because it's multiple cars that would certainly exceed 40,000, and in this case exceed 100,000, we would have to go through the formal process, which is not normally a huge deal, except for we've already called all the GM dealers around here. None of them are going to have Malibus. The state contract vendor, the sole vendor, has none and will have none. So we could go through that process of Gary's house, putting together this multi-page bid document. And likely the only one, if they chose to do it, would be this Columbia Chevrolet dealership, would be the only one to submit a bid. And we already have their bid, which is very attractive. So that's a case to where everybody gets why we have these procurement codes and ordinances in place. But this specific example is how it's become an impediment. So we just need some help with that.
So what are y'all suggesting to help
So
keep?
I have some asks at the end. If you want to listen to all of the issues that we're having first. But one of them would be, in this case, to allow us to go ahead and bring to council for approval the Malibus, even though they're not on state contract and we haven't done a formal bid.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Councilmember Shade had a question or comment?
Yeah, and I think Scott answered some of that for me is, I would certainly like to see those dealers on Highway 17 and Councilmember Appel's district, and Councilmember Waring's district, be able to sell us cars. I mean, those are local businesses in the city of Charleston. But it sounds like there's a availability issue, Scott, if I heard you correctly.
Yes, sir. And historically, we have certainly asked that local dealers consider getting on the state contract. But when they look at the numbers, it just doesn't, from a business standpoint, it just doesn't make any sense to them. Even though we're buying a high volume of cars, these guys that are successfully running this state contract, in the car business, volume means everything for them. They may not be making a lot of money on each car, but they're getting favors in the background for moving that amount of volume. So a real popular car that most dealerships might only get 10 or 15 of, a high volume guy can call in a favor and get 100 of them. So state contract is only successful for these guys because they get what's called holdback money from the manufacturer. They're able to take a great example is Ford F-250s. That truck all day long, $65,000 or $70,000 on a retail lot. On a state contract for the last 2 years, we've been able to buy those cars for less than $35,000. Obviously, the dealer would go broke doing that on the retail side, but there's tons of holdback money for government fleets where they get paid back money from the manufacturers based on the volume that they move. So our Ford connections here in town, there was a time, council member, we were taking the state contract price and asking the local Ford dealers, can you, in fact, our procedures they can be a certain percentage over the state contract price and get local preference, but they've elected not to do it because there's just no money in it.
Hey, I got a 2013 Suburban that has a lot of experience behind it that I can cut you a good deal for.
Well, if it's got less than 200,000 miles, it's probably worth 90,000 right now.
Wow. So Scott, I'm just curious, and I'm sure it's all tied up with the supply chain and chip shortage and everything else, but why are the dealerships not committing to a fixed price on the state contract this year?
So the state contract changed drastically when they went to a cost plus. It's a percentage based over dealer invoices, which what the dealership pays the manufacturer for the car. Mm-hmm. So this example of the GM guy, they're a huge conglomerate of dealerships. And when they told me, listen, Scott, we can't get you anything in 2023, I said, well, why are you even on the state contract? And their response was, we just want to get our foot on the door in South Carolina. They're not even a South Carolina dealer. But the big hiccup for everybody, dealership wise, is especially on fleet vehicles. You think about all the state, county, municipalities throughout the nation, everybody's running 2 to 3 years behind. A great example, a friend of mine on the California Highway Patrol, they haven't gotten any Ford products in several years. So they put in a bid for tons and tons of those cars this year, and they can't even get them, and they're high volume. So the greatest example is on this police interceptor. That plant, the Chicago plant that builds that truck specifically, 7 days a week, fully staffed, can build about 32,000 vehicles in a model year. 2 days into the order bank, they had 62,000 orders. So the first 32,000 are to get built, everybody behind them is not going to get any cars. So that's the same with all the truck lines, fleet truck lines. So even if they can magically build another assembly plant right now, 90% of their parts come from third-party vendors. Those third-party vendors would have to build new plants and everything else. It's just the sheer number of orders are overwhelming the manufacturers. It's 4 to 5 times what they have seen in the past 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
Yep.
And I presume, like you mentioned, the difficulty with the Malibus, that you've been open to consider different brands or different models than what we've been
Yeah.
using in the
Yeah,
past.
so for years, we were using the Ford Fusion.
Right.
Ford doesn't make a sedan anymore. Zero. The only thing they make in a small car is a Mustang, a two-door Mustang. So there's other manufacturers. We've called Nissan, we've called Hyundai, we've called all these other brands, and none of them have any sedans. And frankly, I mean, these guys just want four-door sedans. It's sort of traditional. With four doors for carrying passengers and that sort of thing. They're not wanting SUVs for that detective role. And Chevrolet's Malibu is sort of it right now. It's one of the remaining sedans.
Interesting.
Yes, sir.
All right. Any further questions or thoughts about this? This is really just an update to everybody to know what we're dealing with.
Yeah. So, I mean, Scott covered a lot of what was on that, and, you know, the order banks, we never know when they're going to open, and they're not consistent. So like this year, the F-Series trucks closed January 13th, but the fleet and garbage trucks closed in September of 2022, and that's not consistent. So next year might not be the same timeline. So we never really know when it will open, how long it will be open. It's just impossible to plan for it. So, you know, just getting everything together to even try to plan, even when they open it up, getting everything together in time to get the order done and all of that, it's almost impossible. And of course, none of these timelines ever coincide with our lease purchase cycle either. Talk about that. Lead times are another situation that we're having. We ordered dump trucks in January 2022. We still have not received a delivery date for those. The other part is for dump trucks too, is we've been told we won't be able to buy them this year unless the chassis manufacturer opens up more chassis spots. So it's just a huge issue for us. And what our biggest concern is that we're going to get behind on our replacement schedules, and we're going to have outdated cars again. Garbage and other heavy equipment for environmental services, it takes 18 to 24 months for delivery. We have good relationships, like Scott was talking about all the relationships he has with his dealership. So these relationships that we have help us a lot, because people look out for the city, and we can tell them, please hold us this many or whatever. And usually that works okay. But we have that with some of our garbage trucks. And right now, knuckle booms are taking 20 to 24 months for delivery. We talked a lot about police, so I don't think we need to go into that. But fire trucks is another issue. Last time I had talked with them, ladder trucks always take about 18 months to build. That had increased to 24 months. It's now 36 to 40 months, which poses a significant problem with the new stations that we have to build. So we'll be getting together with the fire department and trying to come up, because we have a very good replacement plan, and we have a very good plan with them. And we talk about when we need to buy trucks and all of that. And we're going to have to sit down and adjust that a little bit because of these lead times.
Councilmember Shade, you had.
Yeah, so Amy, are we getting from each department a anticipated list of what we need out in advance? Are they providing that to you?
Yeah. Yes, police and fire have a very good list. And you know, a lot of that is lease purchase, Councilmember Shade. So we always get that list every single year for environmental services, police, fire, stormwater as well. And then regular fleet also has a list that we go by their list somewhat. We have to do a better job of replacement plan for our regular fleet, which we're working on with them, but that's all part of our lease purchase. So we do get those lists, and that's what we put in our budget for our lease purchase payment. So you'll see the lease purchase contract coming to you for approval soon. But so we do that, and that starts April 1st. So all of these cars that we're buying, you'll see all of them. There's a lot on this next agenda. but we don't pay for those until April because that's when we get the lease purchase money, if that makes sense, or at least.
Yeah. Sort of a follow-up question. You're looking at buying new cars. Is there any interest at all in looking at gently used cars? I mean, particularly like the Malibus and that sort of stuff. Is that something that's not even considered?
In some cases it is. I'll let, for the police department, Scott, tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, we have a lot of used cars already. This is part of our replacement plan with them, where we try to buy 30 to 32 cars every year for the police department. Same with fire. Fire has bought used fire trucks and things like that because of this issue and making sure we have enough reserves. So we do that. We do that in some cases.
Yeah, Amy, the only thing I would add to that is realistically, even if you could find a relatively low mile used Malibu, say a car with 35,000 miles on it, even in this local market, that car would be priced far above the quote I've got for the new cars from the Chevrolet dealership that's sort of honoring state contract pricing. No question in my mind, a used car would be probably $5,000 to $6,000 more than the quote we've got for these brand new cars, assuming we're able to get them.
I'm just concerned more about availability.
Yeah.
In some of these circumstances, but.
Well, one thing, council member, some of these dealerships like this GM dealership in Chevrolet, they look a long ways out. Last year's a good example when there were no police rated Tahoes on the state contract. This dealership, it wasn't really a risk. It was a great business case for them. They ordered 400 of those things knowing they would find 400 buyers. And they were the only dealership on the state contract or any dealership in South Carolina that did that. And the 400 were sold within a week of them getting it. We bought 30 of them. But yeah, it's all about relationships that we've had any success at all. These guys have been on the state contract up until this year, and we can make calls and they're able to find us vehicles. And in this case, that particular dealership's the only one that's got any Malibus. They're really the only ones that ordered any. So they're kind of our go-to.
Thank you, Scott. Councilmember Seekings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Scott, I've just got a real quick question for you, seeing that we're looking out in the future and orders are backlogged. Are we moving towards an internal policy of trying to purchase nothing but high profile vehicles, given our geographic location and our challenges with water? I mean, Malibus sound great, but they're not really that functional if we've got a storm, a flood, all that kind of stuff. So are we moving in that direction?
So obviously, yes, sir. Since I guess the last 3 or 4, since 2019, all of our black and white patrol vehicles have moved to the SUV form. I mean, 2013 was the last year for Ford making a police sedan. So on the patrol side, we're in SUVs. We've added over the last 4 or 5 purchase cycles, those 4-wheel drive F-250s. In fact, emergency management's got one of those now. The fire department's got some of those. So yeah, we're certainly considering that. And these Malibus are for central detectives. You know, we're not buying a lot of sedans, to your point. The work they're doing, there's lots of times they're dealing with victims' families, that sort of thing. And they like that sedan versus the SUV because it's still got a lockable trunk. So if they're on a special team and they've got additional gear, they can lock them in their trunk. They're not in the back of an open SUV, that sort of thing. But yeah, we all of these vehicles we're buying for patrol, they're all-wheel drive. They sit up a little bit higher. And again, we're adding this year, we're actually getting 3 of those F-150 trucks, which are pursuit rated. And we're going to try them in teams 1 and 2 downtown. And we will probably, if they're successful, if the guys like them, if they seem to be doing a good job, and I assume they will, we will probably look at a different mix in coming years. We may add more of them along with the SUVs, split that order a little bit.
Great, thank you.
So Amy, a question for you or anyone with these longer lead times, particularly for the garbage trucks, fire trucks, the grapple or boom trucks. do we need to make some adjustment? I know you can't approve a budget for year after next, but seems like we're having to order things for things we're going to pay for well in advance.
Yeah, so we definitely, that's part of my last bullet here, Mayor, that we need to think through the order process and come up with a different strategy. And we'll work on that and bring something forward because
Okay.
it's not working
Yeah,
anymore.
gotcha.
So one of the asks that we had was that we would like to bring these Malibus to council at the end of February with an explanation. So we can go ahead and procure those items.
Okay.
Like earlier, and then increasing the procurement limits will help in some cases for the smaller dollar vehicle and equipment purchases. But like Scott said, when you're buying that many cars, they would still have to come through council. So we just need a little bit more leeway than we currently have so we can get these vehicles. Any questions?
All right, without objection, we'll have y'all come forward with that. I presume, we have our procurement rules and all like that, but if Scott finds us a really good deal, we can bring something directly for council's approval, correct?
That's what we plan to do with the Malibus, with a very long explanation behind it so that we explain. We just want to make sure that everybody ad hoc understood the challenges that we're having, the real challenges. And we're doing the best that we can to try to get these vehicles, but we would have to do a little bit differently in order to get that done.
Gotcha. Scott, thank you for having and building those relationships. That matters.
Yes, sir. And I would just say on these Malibus, and I think Amy said it best when she said, bring it to council with an explanation. It's not like Scott went out and we're buying these cars in the blind. I mean, I have a written quote from this dealership. Gary and his house could call around to other dealerships I've already spoken with. And for instance, let's just say this stayed below the $40,000 deal. It won't, but let's just say it did. And we could just do like telephone bids or a fax bid or an email bid. The only one that would bid would be this particular dealership because they're the only ones with the cars. Right. So, I mean, our procurement division, to satisfy everybody, could certainly call some other dealerships and say, hey, we need 5 to 10 of these Malibus. Do you want to forward me a quote for it? I'm just suggesting I've already done that. And the result is one quote from one South Carolina dealership. And it's an extremely attractive quote.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions?
All right, parking rates.
Parking revenues. So I just wanted to give you our budgeted numbers here for 2023. Metered garages and lots. These are really your two areas they'd be most concerned with in citations. And then, we talked a lot at the second and third reading of the budget about some changes and increases to the rates. What Council Member Seekings was talking about during the two budget meetings was transient parking rates and hotel parking rates. And Council Member Seekings, if I'm saying something that's not accurate, let me know. But right now for our transient parking rates, the current rate is $18 daily maximum rate, or it's $1 for every 30 minutes. So $2 per hour in the parking garages. Proposed rate would be $27 daily maximum rate, or $1 for every 20 minutes, increasing it to $3 per hour from $2 per hour. And that would yield an increase of about almost 4.9 million. That's a full year of revenue. Hotel parking rates, current rate is $20 a day. Proposed rate would be $30 a day. And that would yield an increase of almost 1.5 million. And again, that would be full year revenue. But in talking about all that, there's other areas that we need to consider that are related to those revenues if we were going to adjust these parking rates. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. Councilmember Seekings, do you want to say anything?
No, so far that jives with the notes that I've got from when we talked about this in November, December. So I'm interested to see what other areas that you think that we can make some adjustments to, because I've got some ideas too, but I'll let you take the lead and see where we go.
Okay, and just because I know y'all like comparisons, so we these are, ABM provided these to us. These are just kind of some regional parking garages, municipal garages, mind you, not private garages, and where we are in relation to them. So we actually, surprisingly, we're higher than a lot of the other garages, municipal garages, which was surprising to me.
Well, Amy, I think one reason for that is the geographic area and the number of people that we have coming through too. I mean, we've got a much more densely populated central area for cars than those cities that you just put up on that spreadsheet, except for maybe one.
So some of the additional things that we think need to be considered if we were to adjust the transient, especially the transient rates, is the meter. So if you raise the transient parking rates in the garages, you have to consider the on-street parking rates for the meters. Otherwise, people are just going to park on the street and not go into the garages because it'll be cheaper to park on the street. Current parking meter rates are $1 per 30 minutes or $2 per hour. So they match our garage rate, hourly rate right now. So we would need to increase the parking meters to, at a minimum, match the parking garage rate. So it would need to be increased to $1.50 for every half hour, or so it's $3 per hour. If that's what we were going to raise the transient parking rate in the garage to. Does that make sense? Am I talking too fast? Okay. Industry best practices actually recommend that on-street parking is set at a higher rate than the parking garages to encourage more people into the garages and aid in parking meter turnover. So that is another option for us to consider, but we think we at least need to have them match each other. Make sense? Then
Yes.
lost ticket fees, we would need to increase that as well. Otherwise, there's no real penalty for losing your ticket. So the current lost ticket fee is $30. So if our current daily rate increases to 27, there's not much of a differential there and not much of a penalty. People can just say, I'll just pay the lost ticket fee. So we would need to consider a proportional amount that will deter people from just accepting the lost ticket fee. Any questions? So if you're raising the parking meter fee or rate, then you have to adjust the parking ticket fees as well. Otherwise, it doesn't deter you from getting a parking ticket. So these are our ticket fees. Improper parking is $10. So we would want to increase those some proportional amount as well. And just in comparison to some other municipalities, our parking ticket fees are below Folly Beach, Myrtle Beach, and Savannah, but we are higher than Columbia. Just add some additional information. So that's another area I think we would need to consider.
Do you know how much those, just that $14 comparable ticket is in Savannah and Myrtle Beach, for example?
I do. I don't know. Robbie, are you on here? Hold on. Yes, I can tell you that. Which, did you ask me Savannah? What did you ask me, Mayor?
Savannah, say in Myrtle Beach, the comparable ticket.
Savannah improper parking is $20 in Savannah.
Correct.
And in Myrtle Beach, it's also $20.
In Myrtle Beach as well, the meter violation is $30.
Yep.
And it's $20 in Savannah.
Mhm.
Gotcha. Okay. When's the last time we changed that fee, Robbie? Do you know approximately?
It was quite some time ago. I remember the meter fee, I believe, was $6 before we increased it to 14.
Right. It's been 14 a long time now, I think. Councilmember Shade?
Yeah, Amy, would you mind going back to that special event slide?
Special event. This one? Yeah.
Yeah.
We just haven't gotten there yet. Yes.
Okay.
Are we done with the meter violation or the parking meter or the parking ticket fees? Sorry. Oof. Been a long day, I guess.
I think
I
so.
have can I ask a quick question before you get off the slide? Because we've done projections on the other increases, what they will net out in terms of increased revenue. Have we figured out if we go to a meter violation of $20, either Amy or Robbie, what that would render in additional revenue? Projected, I know that it can't be a certainty.
We have not projected that out yet.
Okay. Gotcha.
So,
Councilmember,
I'm sorry.
go
on.
ahead, Amy.
So special event, I'm sorry, Councilmember Ring.
No,
Okay.
you answered it. You answered when you answered Councilman Seeking question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Special event fee, it's $5 per vehicle. We would, we should probably consider that as well. It's a pretty low rate, in comparison to other places. But we would not increase the rate we have in place for our food and beverage workers that utilize the special rates in the garages. And those are those 4 garages. And those are the rates that we have, but we would not want to touch those. We would leave those alone. Any questions on that, Councilmember Shade?
Yeah, Gilliard is not considered on this.
It is not.
Why not?
Matt might be able to answer that better, but it's probably because it's more utilized in the other garages up to a certain time.
So you have 2 separate things going on here. In the top part, when we talk about special event fee, we're referencing when somebody, like when we have a standing agreement with the Gilliard, when they have a show going on, it is a $5 set parking fee that's done through an agreement or a special event permit, parking permit request for the specific garage. These are done on a case-by-case basis. All the big events, the bridge run, Seawee, anytime there's an event at the Gilliard, that's that $5 special event fee that Amy's talking about, where it's parking dedicated specifically for event in a garage, if the garage has the capacity and the event is large enough. The ones below are all garages that have special parking rates at certain times of the evening that are all associated with high tourist areas that don't have occupancy issues around a lot of our hospitality industries that aren't necessarily tied to garages, or in the case of the Gilliard, you know, there's not a lot going on necessarily around the Gilliard except the Gilliard itself. Not a lot of people go to park there if they're going out to dinner, so there's no reason to set a flat rate tied to that one. Is the primary reason. I mean,
Yeah, but Matt, I think that at the Gilliard, particularly if it's a Charleston Symphony Orchestra or some other event there, they do charge a flat rate of $5.
That is the special event fee up above that is referenced. That's already done per agreement with the Gilliard. That's completely separate than the bottom part.
You can have a special event fee rate in any of the garages if you fill out the form to do it, Councilmember Shade. These are just for the food and beverage, like for those areas.
Okay, so you're just not throwing them into the special event fee.
This is just
that's
that
just considered a
special
standard. Okay, I got you.
I'm saying we should probably consider all the, you know, that special event rate for all the special events that we have in the city, but all of the garages, that's the fee we should consider, but we need to leave this one alone for the food and beverage workers. That's what I'm saying. Is that
I got you.
clear?
I
Okay.
got it. Thanks.
Yes. Any other questions on this slide? Okay, and then just so you know, we're in the process of replacing all the meter heads on the peninsula. And we're working with the vendor on a plan for replacement, you know, which areas we should replace first, all of that. Also working with them on a pricing plan, for example, should some areas be priced higher than other areas? And depending on this, how would that affect, you know, what we're talking about with the transient rates and all of that. Another consideration is whether we should continue to accept coins. Just some statistics that 25% of our meter repairs are caused by coins. We collect about $2,000 a month in coins. The new meters will allow for credit cards, smart cards, and the ability to pay with a mobile app. So we're not sure that coins are still necessary, but that's another decision that we need to make. And then with all of those decisions we need to make with the meter heads and replacing all that, it probably would make sense to do all of that together at the same time, in our opinion.
So if I may suggest, the one item that Councilmember Seekings originally suggested about the fee for hotels seems to me to be a little independent of this issue between the meters and the garage fees and how they relate to one another. So that's one area that I would recommend we consider moving forward with. I think she had mentioned on the slide it would generate about $1.5 million, and that would be a good thing. I think my recollection of our discussion at council, everybody seemed pretty favorable to that adjustment. What do you think, Robbie, the timing is on the meter replacement and when all that's going to occur?
I just got the, I guess the parking meter pricing proposal today. I got it this afternoon, so I gotta definitely vet that and get back with procurement. But once they told me that once we are okay and we sign off on a contract, it'll take 8 to 10 weeks for us to get the equipment in place. So we're looking at, March, mid-March maybe, if everything goes well.
Gotcha. Councilmember Seekings?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple things. And first and foremost, I just want to say to Amy and Matt, thank you very much for doing all this, particularly when we were going through the budgeting process at the end of last year. I know it was stressful, and I appreciate, I think we all do appreciate the numbers you've shown us. Mayor, I agree with you. We can do the hotels pretty quickly. I was fortunate enough to sit on the selection committee for the procurement process for the new meters. That it's a pretty smart group that's very technologically savvy. And I think one of the things we ought to do as we adjust our rates is talk to them about best practices and how best to do it. And if we have to wait 8 to 10 weeks, I think that's probably a pretty good idea. Y'all may recall that we engaged Kimley Horn some number of years ago now to do a parking study. And it's sort of been sitting on the shelf, but it was more than a parking study. It was really a mobility study. And during that process, you all may remember this, we brought in the parking managers from Boston, Seattle, and Columbus, Ohio, all of who gave us some input on best practices. And one of the things they talked about from Seattle in particular was this whole idea of, supply and demand and what has now become sort of law of the land and mobility surge pricing. And with the technologies that we've got, we may very well be able to adopt some policy in line with that, when there's a huge demand in the center part of the city, the rates go up, and around the edges of the city where the meters aren't quite as utilized, the rates are down, and that will spread the demand across the city. So I think I'm 100% behind looking at these rates and raising them and doing it in a way that makes sense and getting some input from our team as they come in and replace those meter heads. So timing seems to be pretty good. So again, thank you all. One more thing. By the way, yesterday at TNT, we talked about valet and sort of maybe adjusting the valet process. I think we should build into that, thinking about how we're going to fee out the valet process if we have specific valet sites to take on-street parking away. And that's another source of revenue that we could probably look at as we go forward. So with that, I'll cede the floor.
All right. Any comments, questions, thoughts from anyone? Councilmember Appel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think this is a great exercise for us to go through all this and make tweaks that are appropriate. I want to just to pose sort of a general question, and if this is beyond the scope of our meeting today, that's fine. We can address it maybe at another time. But I read the article over the weekend about the parking garage over on Wentworth needing all kinds of repairs and improvements, and it got me thinking, are we sort of rating this parking revenue to prop up the general fund at the expense of some of the, maintenance and activities we ought to be doing on our parking garages? I just want to kind of get a bit of a sense of that. And because I sort of see that as potentially being related, I wanted to maybe get some comments from whoever has them.
Well, I would respond to that thought by saying over time we had deferred maintenance. I don't think Jason Kronsberg. Well, Jason Kronsberg is on the call here. We deferred maintenance in garages a time or two because we were utilizing parking revenue to balance our general fund budget, and that's what led us to have that study done. We were ready to move forward, of course, with repairs, and now are moving forward with those repairs. But you're absolutely right, council member. That reliance that we had on the parking revenue to do our daily regular city business year in, year in out, I think it did push us to delay some repairs that we could have kept up over time, and we're playing catch up right now. Amy, am I misstating that?
So I actually have some slides on that because we touched on it a little bit at that last meeting, the second and third reading of the budget, but we hadn't really talked about that. And I know that we have a lot of newer council members as well that weren't really part of the discussions when we were talking about the parking, with the general fund being a little bit more reliant on the parking fund than we liked. So I have some slides if you would like me to go through those.
Please.
So like I said, several years we had been discussing, and this was before the pandemic hit, just the reliance the general fund had on the parking fund. General fund expenditures had been outpacing the parking fund surplus. We had always shown this graph, which I have the graph sort of a little bit different graph of how that was. You could see the parking surplus was much smaller than the gap in the general fund revenues and expenses. So we had the concern that the parking fund would not be able to sustain the level of support it had been providing to the general fund. And so this is the slide that I would like to show. The blue line is the general fund expenditures, and you can see how they're growing and growing every year. But our surplus in the parking fund is basically staying flat. And we did not include, you'll see right here, it just goes from 2019 to 22 because 20 and 21, the pandemic hit. It just makes it skewed the graph so much because there was no surplus. So we just left those 2 years out because it just made the graph look funny. And so that is kind of where we were, just a little bit concerned about that and adding new garages and then the maintenance on the garages. We're working on a policy as a guideline as to how much support the general fund should receive from the enterprise funds that we'll bring through this year as well. We do have the maintenance requirements in each of the garages that we have to consider. So you can't use all the parking fund surplus to the general fund every year, because then you're not going to have the maintenance money there to perform the maintenance that we need to do on the garages. The enterprise fund should be self-sufficient, not only in their operating, but also enough fund balance for their long-term needs. So we just need to make sure that we're preserving that. And we're also working on a fund balance policy for our enterprise funds as well. And then we did have that structural engineering report from 2018 with a little over $3 million in immediate and short-term needs. And we do have that contract. It started in April of 2022. I think we're about 22% through that contract to date. And probably some of that, the cost estimate is out of date. So I'm certain that a little bit more funding will be needed for those projects. So that's really, we just want everybody to keep that in mind with the parking fund and the general fund. Any questions on that?
Councilmember Shade, then with Seekings.
To answer Councilmember Appel and then Amy, well done on these follow-up slides. We've been kicking this can down the street for a number of years, and we've been using the garage as a cash cow. So what I would suggest, and I like Amy, what you've gone through with this slide and your presentation, is that if we're going to do this, that we dedicate a percentage of this increase to a restricted fund or the restricted account to make sure that we have enough money to start addressing these immediate needs, because it is pretty bad. We rely on these garages for income, and we have deferred maintenance on it far too long. It's time that we start addressing this, and we start doing it rather quickly. There are other garages that we need to be looking at besides what was in the paper the other day, Councilmember Appel. And I think that's what Amy's alluding to, what we need to be doing to get on the ball with this as soon as possible. I've got to sign off because I got to go to a neighborhood meeting over in West Ashley. Mr. Mayor, thank you for allowing me to chime in, and hopefully I didn't hog too much of the conversation this afternoon. But Amy, thank you again for your staff and all the work that y'all have done. But I've got to head over to West Ashley.
I'm going to ask Edmund or Jason in a minute to update us on the progress on the maintenance of the garages, and we'll follow up with you separately tomorrow or the next day.
And I just wanted to add too, for the Councilmember Shade, the policies that we will write and bring for you all, it will take care of exactly what you just said. So we wouldn't have to set up a separate account or anything like that. It would just be in fund balance, and there would be policies behind all of that.
Good.
Right.
Thank you. I'm sorry you have to leave early, but another city.
We're good.
That's okay. Have a good night.
Where is that meeting, Councilman?
It's to address the Ashley Landing plans.
Yeah, I know, but where is it?
It's going to be at the the old Amish furniture store.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So come join us, and we can chat afterwards if you can be able to
Good
make
deal.
it.
Yeah. I can walk to there from my office.
Yeah, 5:30. So I need to beat the traffic.
Gotcha.
Thank y'all.
Council Member Seekings or Gregory, did y'all have something?
If you don't mind, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to wait and ask my question or make my observation until after we hear from Edmund and Jason about the maintenance side of things.
Yeah, so, and just to be clear to everybody, and you might have gotten it from the article, but that Wentworth Street garage, the building itself belongs to the state of South Carolina by way of the College of Charleston. The land is ours, but that wasn't our building. But needless to say, we've been on this journey to analyze what repairs are needed in all the garages, and we're ready to move forward with COVID, and we got delayed. But Jason and or Edmund, tell us where we are now.
I think Edmund's probably teed up to address this.
Okay.
Yeah, I could take it. So just a quick recap. 2017, we did the procurement for an engineering team to go through the 13 garages, including Wentworth, to basically do what we were calling the structural repairs needs. Probably shouldn't call it structural repairs, just all the repair needs that all these garages require. We got that report back, and we made a budget request to council in 2018 for, I believe it was about $4.5 million, which would cover design services and the absolute immediate needs for repairs in those garages. Now, we call these life safety needs, and it doesn't mean that the garages are falling down, but it's everything from, upgrading the call box inside the elevator to signage to, spall repairs, which is when, rebar kind of starts to expand, it rusts, and it pushes out the concrete. More it's usually aesthetic, but if it goes left untreated, it becomes a structural repair over years. So this is why we have to be on top of this stuff. So after that procurement was done for that report and we had funding in place, we had to go back out to procurement, go through the selection committee process again in order to retain an engineer to actually do repair documents, bid documents, essentially. Now, Wentworth garage was peeled off from that, and we were focused on the 12 garages because of the college was going to take care of their repairs on that. So I won't continue down that road, but you have to keep in mind that, this is an enormous project for capital projects. This is 12 projects. We're just talking about parking garages here. So we're working with the vendor. It's ADC Engineers, and they're actually putting together the bid documents right now. And to back up a little bit, we did have to pause this work during COVID, and we restarted them I think it was about a year and a half ago to start these documents. And like everybody else, they're backed up with work too. Because this is such a large project, we're actually going to group garages together either by region or location, or similar types of repairs because we don't want to scare away the smaller contractors that may be available to do work now. So what that allows the vendor to do is to focus in on those bid documents for 3 garages, and we get that out on the street, and then we start those repairs immediately while they start on the next 3 garages. We currently plan to have the first set out by probably late second quarter, early third quarter, so sometime this summer. And I'm told by the engineer that we're going to have all 12 garages out to bid by the end of this year.
What are the first 3 that you're doing, Edmund? Do you know?
Hey, I knew you were going to ask me a question I could answer. I don't have that off the top of my head.
That's all right.
I
just
can get
thought
that
you
to you,
might
sir.
know. No problem. All right. Anybody want to, Councilmember Seekings?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just very briefly, Amy, do you mind just going back to that graph that you showed, which I think is really sort of interesting and very telling? It seems to me that that graph would counsel in favor of trying to catch up some on our fees that we're charging through parking, right? So we can continue to keep at least a static surplus, if not a little bit more as our expenses. I think I remember when I first got elected to council, the budget right there was what, 137 million, right? It's gone up precipitously, going to double pretty soon. So I think we're on the right track with the parking. And I know one of the slides you put up there was concerns about over-reliance on parking. I would just remind everybody on this committee, as a percentage basis of our budget that we actually passed without doing any adjustments to the parking fees, the total amount in our budget is 35 million bucks, which was that come out to, Amy? 5% of our budget? No, more than that. Sorry.
Yeah, well,
Whatever
we're
that-
talking about the the deficit that we always have in the general fund side and
Right.
using enterprise funds to fill that gap. That's
Right.
what we mean by that. Yeah.
No, I get it. And so, I mean, keeping those enterprise funds available to fill that gap and increasing that fund if we can seems like a pretty good idea. And we ought to do the best we can to do it in a fair and equitable way, but in a way that reflects the supply and demand that we've got out there and the opportunities we have to increase our revenues. So I'm certainly all in favor of it. And I would hope all of us will take a hard look at that as we build the budget for next year.
That's right. And, but I think it's a salient point that Councilmember Shade made that, and I'm not saying after adjusting parking fees that you would need to dedicate 100% of that increase to this deferred maintenance that we're working on, but we need to take care of this deferred maintenance over the next year and get these 12 projects completed. That's for sure.
100%.
That would
Agreed.
be all part of this policy here that we're talking about is how much should the enterprise fund support the general fund. And that would give us a very clear guide on how much we should be supported by the general fund should be supported by the
Gotcha.
funds and give us, make sure we're staying within the line, I guess, for lack of a better way to say that.
Yeah.
After we paint new ones in the garages.
All right.
Okay, so any other questions, comments on that?
I think we're good.
Okay, the last thing is current city fees. We had talked about some of the city fees. I gave you the inventory of fees. I can send it back to you again. I think it was in October when I sent it. So if you all would like me to send it to you again, I can. Just let me know. But we had talked about some of the current city fees that we have that we know we need to look at in 2023 and fully intend to do that so that we could budget for that in 2024. Recreation fees, we did do some of those fees in 23 budgets, but we also want to look at the facility fees. I don't think we've not updated them since 2009. And that also kind of needs to be completely restructured as well. So that is one project we will tackle in 23. Public service, most were adjusted in 2019. So we'll probably look at those along with engineering fees and then stormwater permit fees, not stormwater utility fees, but the permit fees that go along with it, which is on the next slide over here somewhere, stormwater. Traffic and transportation, we looked at those and we created the new fees for right-of-way obstructions, if you remember that. But we will look at certificate of public conveyance this year as well. Planning has already just recently updated their fees. Fire marshal, like I said, that whole kind of permit center process, we'll look at those fees in 2023 as well. So those are the ones that we currently have that we know that we need to update, as well as livability and tourism. We talked about that, the carriage medallion fees, the tour guide manual, the bus permitting fee, and the tourism ticket fee. It's been a very, very long time since we've looked at those fees. So we'll look at those. And then also our special events fees that, I don't know if y'all know, livability and tourism is over the whole special event process. So we're gonna look at that as well. And then like we talked about before, develop a policy on how often we should be reviewing fees and adjusting them. And then we know there are new fees that council would like to consider. So we're pretty much having ad hoc meetings every month this year. I know everybody's excited about that. So we can add that to the agenda for our next meeting if that is what you would like to do. Yes.
Yes.
And I think some of you are working with legal on some, so we haven't really been involved with that. So if we need to do some legwork before the meeting to have some information, that would be great if we could get involved in that somehow. So.
Councilmember Waring.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to compliment staff, everybody involved, Mike, you, the mayor. I mean, everybody involved with this one, bringing this stuff forward as soon as you have into this year, as opposed to, the ad hoc process, which is a good process, but that time sure goes fast between late July and the December vote. I like the idea of maybe spreading it out over a longer period of time. It's more meetings, but we won't have as many subjects, crammed in each meeting. So, and the fee income part, I just think that's awesome. And the reason I say that, the $1 billion banks, I should say $1 trillion banks, the biggest part of their bottom line is fee income. Those time that government kind of steps up there too. And especially when, Councilmember Pell has his workshop. I'm looking forward to it on that new state legislation that passed last year. We can be brought up to speed on that. But thanks everybody who's involved with this one. This was a good meeting.
Well, thank you. So if I may comment, Amy, this middle section here is a great thing to consider for the future. We need to develop a policy that dictates how often we will review and adjust fees. And it seemed to be a recurring theme of the meeting earlier, when we said, well, we hadn't adjusted the procurement limit in 20 plus years. We haven't adjusted the parking fee meter ticket for 20 years, and it seems like if we had, I know back when I was a wholesaler and you had an increase from your supplier, you had to pass it along to your customer, right? So even just taking inflation into account, and don't get me wrong, you probably get into more trouble than it's worth every year to adjust 2 or 3%. But it's like if you follow cumulative cost of living, and when it hits 5%, to have those fees that kind of automatically will go up 5%, or some kind of schema like that, so we don't get into this trap again and go 20, 30 years on fees and other charges to recover our costs and reasonably, stay current with our revenue sources. So I don't know what the specific answer would be, but that's a very wise thing for y'all to have suggested and pursued.
So Mayor, when we did the inventory of all the fees, that will help in that process until we get a better system. Technology is always not our friend sometimes, but it makes it a little bit harder for us to gather data and things like that. But that inventory will help us come up with a good schedule for increasing those fees.
Absolutely. All right. Well, all good work. Any other business to come before us this afternoon? Any questions?
I will be sending out all of those meeting requests. I've been very busy with ERP demonstrations for the last month. So I'm a little bit free now. So you will be getting lots of invitations from me shortly.
Great. Great work, y'all. Good information. If there's no further business, we shall adjourn and see y'all at a meeting soon, I'm sure.